Rain tapped gently against the window of apartment 403 as a small boy sat cross-legged on his mother's bed, holding her favorite photograph close to his chest. The bedroom still smelled of her lavender perfume, making his heart ache with fresh waves of grief. Just 3 days had passed since that terrible morning when he couldn't wake his mom up for breakfast. He remembered every detail of that day with painful clarity. He had gotten up early, excited to show her the perfect math score on his test from the day before. She always made such a big deal about his good grades, usually celebrating with their special ritual of chocolate chip pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse ears. But that morning, something was different. She hadn't responded to his gentle shoulder taps or even when he called out, "Mom," in progressively louder voices. Their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had heard his frightened cries through the thin walls. She'd rushed over in her flowered robe and fuzzy slippers, still holding her morning cup of tea. One look at the situation, and she'd immediately called 911, then pulled him into a tight hug that smelled of jasmine and mothballs. Everything after that became a blur of paramedics, police officers, and social workers speaking in hushed voices. Words like cardiac arrest and undiagnosed condition floated around him, but all he could focus on was how peaceful his mother looked, as if she were just taking a nap after one of her long double shifts at the diner. Now, 3 days later, he sat in the growing darkness of their small apartment. Mrs. Chen and her husband had been taking turns checking on him, bringing over homemade dumplings and trying their best to comfort him. But he overheard them talking in the hallway earlier that day. They couldn't keep watching him forever. Someone from social services would be coming tomorrow morning to take him to what they called a temporary placement facility. The boy knew what that meant. His best friend from school had gone to one of those places last year after his parents got into trouble. When he came back 2 months later, he wasn't the same happy kid anymore. He talked about different homes, different beds, different rules every few weeks. That wasn't going to happen to him. He couldn't let it. His mom had always told him stories about her own childhood, about moving from place to place, never feeling like she belonged anywhere until she had him. "We're each other's home," she would say, tickling his nose with her long braids as she hugged him goodnight. "As long as we're together, we're home." Looking around their small apartment now, he could see traces of their life together everywhere. The height marks on the kitchen doorframe, starting from when he was just tall enough to reach the light switch. The slightly crooked family photo wall she'd created, featuring school pictures, park snapshots, and her favorite photo, the one he now held in his hands. It showed her in her waitress uniform on her first day at Joe's Diner, standing proud and tall with her arm around the owner. She'd worked there ever since, eventually becoming the morning shift supervisor. With trembling fingers, he carefully tucked the precious photo into his school backpack, along with his mom's old wallet containing $43 and her library card. He added his favorite blue sweater, the one she'd saved up to buy him for his last birthday, a small bag of crackers from the kitchen, and his stuffed penguin that had helped him sleep since he was 3. As the streetlights began flickering on outside, casting long shadows across the bedroom floor, he knew it was time. Mrs. Chen would be coming soon with his dinner. She always brought it at 6:30, right after her favorite TV show ended. His heart pounded as he zipped up the backpack and slipped on his most comfortable sneakers. He took one last look around the only home he'd ever known, his eyes lingering on his mother's neatly made bed. "I'll make you proud, Mom," he whispered into the quiet room. "I promise." The city looked different at night. The boy had never been out alone this late before, and the familiar streets of his neighborhood felt like a different world in the darkness. The evening air had turned chilly, making him glad he'd worn his thick blue sweater. Clutching his backpack straps tightly, he walked quickly past the corner store where he used to buy ice cream with his mom after school. His stomach growled, reminding him that he'd skipped lunch. The bag of crackers in his backpack tempted him, but he knew he needed to save them. His mom had always taught him about being prepared, about making things last when times were tough. He could almost hear her voice. A little patience now means a lot less worry later, sweetie. The sound of approaching sirens made him duck into a narrow alley. His heart raced as police cars sped past, their lights painting the brick walls in flashes of red and blue. He wondered if they were looking for him. By now, Mrs. Chen would have discovered he was gone. She'd probably called the police, worried sick about the little boy who disappeared from apartment 403. As he wandered further from his neighborhood, the streets became unfamiliar. Tall buildings loomed overhead like giants, their windows reflecting the glow of streetlights. Late-night workers hurried past, too busy with their own lives to notice a small boy walking alone. Some carried takeout bags that filled the air with tempting smells of burgers and fries, making his hunger even worse. The public library appeared ahead like a beacon of hope. He remembered coming here with his mom on Saturday mornings, spending hours picking out books and reading together in the big comfy chairs. The building was closed now, but the wide stone steps offered some shelter from the wind. He sat down, pulling his knees to his chest to stay warm. Taking out his mother's photo, he studied it under the nearby streetlight. The diner's neon sign glowed behind her in the picture, making her look like she had a halo. His fingers traced the edges of her smile, and tears began to blur his vision. What would she think of him running away like this? But he couldn't bear the thought of being sent away, of losing the last pieces of connection to her. A group of teenagers walked by, laughing and talking loudly. He shrank back into the shadows, making himself as small as possible. His mom had always warned him about staying safe after dark, but he hadn't really understood what she meant until now. The city felt bigger and scarier with each passing minute. The crackers didn't last long once he finally gave in to his hunger. Each bite reminded him of afternoon snacks at their kitchen table, his mom asking about his day while she prepared dinner. The memory brought fresh tears, but he wiped them away quickly. He had to be strong now. More police cars patrolled the streets as the night grew deeper. He noticed one car in particular that kept driving past the library, moving slowly as if searching for something or someone. The officer behind the wheel had kind eyes and gray hair at his temples. He seemed different from the others, less rushed, more watchful. The boy's eyelids grew heavy as exhaustion began to set in. He fought to stay awake, knowing he couldn't fall asleep out here on the street. But the events of the day, the walking, and the emotional toll were catching up with him. His head nodded forward, then snapped back up as he forced himself to stay alert. That's when he heard footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate steps coming up the library stairs. His heart began to race again as he looked up to see the officer with the kind eyes standing there, concern written across his face. The boy's hand instinctively tightened around the photo in his pocket. In that moment, he had to make a choice. Run again into the darkness or trust this stranger who seemed different from the others. The officer took another step forward, carefully, like someone approaching a scared cat. He didn't reach for his radio or try to grab the boy. Instead, he simply sat down on the steps, leaving enough space between them to show he meant no harm. "It's pretty cold out here tonight," he said softly, his voice warm and gentle like a grandfather's. "Would you like to tell me what brings you to the library so late?" The library steps felt colder now as the boy sat there, studying the officer's face in the dim light. Something about the man's gentle presence made the tight knot in his stomach loosen just a bit. The officer wasn't typing on his phone or speaking into his radio like the others had done back at his apartment. He was simply sitting there, patient and still, as if he had all the time in the world. "I used to bring my daughter to this library," the officer said quietly, looking up at the grand old building. "She loved the beanbag chairs in the children's section. Could never get her to leave without checking out at least 3 books." He smiled at the memory, and for a moment, his eyes seemed far away. The boy shifted slightly, pulling his backpack closer. He wasn't sure why, but hearing about the officer's daughter made him feel less scared. Maybe it was because the man talked like a regular dad. not like someone trying to get him in trouble. "I bet you're hungry," the officer continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an unopened granola bar. "My wife always makes sure I have a snack in my pocket for long nights." He placed the granola bar on the step between them, then moved his hand away. "It's yours if you want it." The wrapper crinkled temptingly in the night breeze. After a moment's hesitation, the boy reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly. As he ate, the officer kept talking in that same gentle voice, sharing little stories about his family, about funny things that happened on his patrol, about his favorite books when he was a kid. Something warm and unexpected began to grow in the boy's chest. Trust, maybe, or hope. His hand found its way to his pocket, where his mother's photo lay safely folded. The officer noticed the movement. "What's that you've got there?" he asked softly. "Must be something pretty special for you to keep it so close." The boy's fingers closed around the photo. He'd been holding onto it like a shield, but now it felt more like a bridge. Slowly, carefully, he pulled it out and smoothed the creases. His mother's smile beamed up at him, forever frozen in that happy moment at the diner. When he finally held out the photo for the officer to see, something extraordinary happened. The man's kind face suddenly changed. His eyes widened, and his mouth opened slightly, as if all the air had been knocked from his lungs. His hand, reaching for the photo, trembled visibly in the streetlight. This woman," the officer's voice cracked with emotion. "I know her. I could never forget her face." He looked at the boy with new understanding, tears gathering in his eyes. "She's your mother, isn't she?" The boy nodded, speaking for the first time that night. She died 3 days ago," he whispered, his own tears starting again. "I didn't want to go to a foster home. I didn't want to forget her." The officer's hand moved to his chest, touching a spot near his heart. 10 years ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was a young officer, new to the force. I got into trouble one night. Bad trouble. Shot twice, bleeding out in an alley. Everyone ran away, except one person. A young waitress coming home from her late shift. She stayed with me, pressed her hands against my wounds, kept talking to me so I wouldn't pass out." He looked down at the photo again, his finger gently touching the image. "She saved my life that night. I tried to find her later, to thank her properly, but she'd moved on from that neighborhood. I never knew her name, but I've prayed for her every day since then. She was wearing that exact uniform in that exact diner." The boy stared at him, his heart pounding. Could it be true? His mom had never mentioned saving a police officer's life, but it sounded exactly like something she would do. She was always helping people, always saying that kindness comes back to you in unexpected ways. The officer wiped his eyes and took a deep breath. "I think," he said carefully, looking at the boy with new purpose, "that your mother is still looking out for you. She brought you to me tonight, and I promise her that I'm going to help you. Will you let me do that?" Under the soft glow of the street lamps, on those cold library steps, 2 lives touched by the same remarkable woman found each other. And in that moment, something that had been broken in both their hearts began to heal. Inside the warmth of the all-night diner, the boy sat across from the officer in a cozy booth near the window. Steam rose from his hot chocolate, topped with extra whipped cream, just the way his mom used to make it. The officer had brought him here after their emotional conversation on the library steps, saying that some stories are better told over warm food. "I was only 2 years into the job," the officer began, stirring his coffee slowly. "It was a night just like this one, maybe a bit colder. I was responding to a call about suspicious activity in the warehouse district." His eyes grew distant with the memory. "I was young, too confident, thought I could handle anything. That overconfidence almost cost me everything." The boy leaned forward, wrapped in the officer's story, the half-eaten grilled cheese sandwich on his plate temporarily forgotten as he listened. "I walked into an ambush that night. 2 shots caught me before I even knew what was happening. I remember falling, the cold concrete against my face, my radio just out of reach. The officer's hand unconsciously moved to his side where the bullets had struck. Everyone ran. The bad guys, the witnesses, everyone. Except your mother. He pulled out his own worn photograph from his wallet, a newspaper clipping yellowed with age. It showed a younger version of the officer receiving an award, but his eyes weren't on the photo. They were on the crowd in the background, where a blurry figure stood watching the ceremony. She was walking home from her late shift when she heard the shots. Instead of running away like anyone else would, she ran toward the danger. Found me bleeding out in that alley. His voice grew soft with emotion. She took off her diner apron and pressed it against my wounds. Kept talking to me, telling me to stay awake, that her little boy needed a bedtime story that night, and I was going to help her think of a good one. The boy's eyes widened. He remembered those bedtime stories, how his mom always had a new one ready each night. Had some of them come from that night? She stayed with me until help arrived, even though she didn't know if the shooters might come back. The paramedics said later that without her quick action, I wouldn't have made it. The officer wiped at his eyes with his napkin. When I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, she was gone. Left a note saying she was glad I was okay. Signed it just your guardian angel from Joe's Diner. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an old, creased piece of paper. I've carried this note every day since then. Tried to find her, but she'd already moved on from that diner. New management didn't know where she'd gone. I just wanted to thank her, to tell her that she gave my kids their father back that night. The boy touched his mother's photo, now lying between them on the table. She never told me about this, he said quietly. But she always said that helping others was like planting seeds of hope. You never know when they might grow into something beautiful. The officer smiled through his tears. That sounds exactly like her. And now here you are, her son, sitting across from me all these years later. Life has a way of coming full circle, doesn't it? A waitress came by to refill their drinks, and the officer used the moment to compose himself. After I recovered, I started a program at the station to honor unnamed heroes in our community. We've helped dozens of families over the years, all because your mother showed me that sometimes the biggest heroes are just ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The boy felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the hot chocolate. His mom had always seemed special to him, but knowing she had saved someone's life, that she had made such a difference, it made him feel proud in a way he'd never experienced before. You know, the officer said thoughtfully, I think she's still helping people, even now. She led you to those library steps tonight, right where I always patrol. That wasn't just coincidence. That was her looking out for both of us, one last time. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in thoughts of the remarkable woman who had touched their lives so deeply. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky, promising a new day, and perhaps a new beginning for both of them. Morning sunlight streamed through the police station windows as the officer led the boy through the busy hallways. Other officers smiled warmly at them, some offering the boy donuts or hot chocolate from the break room. It felt strange being here, not as a lost child, but as someone with a purpose. My desk isn't much, the officer said, pulling up a small extra chair beside his own. But I think we can make it work for our investigation. He cleared some space, carefully placing the boy's mother's photo in the center. This is going to be our starting point. The boy watched as the officer typed on his computer, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Your mom must have had dreams, plans, he said softly. People don't just disappear without leaving traces. They leave behind little pieces of themselves, like breadcrumbs for us to follow. A young female officer brought over a box of old records. These are all the files from that year, she said, smiling at the boy. I remember your mom from the diner. She always gave me extra fries and told me to stay safe on patrol. She squeezed his shoulder gently before walking away. As they dug through paperwork, The officer explained everything he was doing. See these. He pointed to some old newspaper clippings. Your mom used to write letters to the editor about community safety. She was trying to get better lighting installed in the park, more crossing guards near schools. He smiled, always thinking about protecting others. The boy picked up one of the yellowed papers, touching his mother's printed name. She used to take me to that park, he said quietly. She'd point out which spots needed fixing, tell me that someday she'd make it better for everyone. Hours passed as they searched through databases and old records. The officer made phone calls, each conversation adding another piece to the puzzle of his mother's life. They discovered she'd been taking night classes at the community college, studying to become a social worker. Look at this, the officer said, pointing to his screen. She was searching for someone too, her father. He turned to the boy. Did she ever mention your grandfather? The boy shook his head. She just said he lived far away, that someday they'd find each other again. The officer's eyes lit up with determination. Well, that gives us another trail to follow. He pulled up more records, his face glowing in the computer screen's light. Your mom was doing her own investigation, trying to track him down. These are her search records from the library computer. They ordered lunch, sandwiches, and sodas, eating right there at the desk as they worked. Other officers stopped by, sharing stories about the times they'd met his mom at the diner, each memory adding colors to the picture of who she had been beyond just being his mother. She was searching Milwaukee, the officer said suddenly, pointing to a series of addresses. Look at these library records. She was requesting newspapers from Milwaukee, birth records, old phone books. He leaned back, thinking. That's not too far from here. Just a couple hours away. The boy felt his heart speed up. Do you think? I think your mom was getting close, the officer nodded. These searches get more specific over time. She was narrowing it down. He started typing again, his fingers flying over the keys. And with the resources we have here at the station, we might be able to finish what she started. As afternoon turned to evening, the station grew quieter. But they kept working, following each lead, each possibility. The boy watched the officer's face, saw how he treated this search like it was the most important case he'd ever handled. Your mom never gave up, the officer said, stretching after hours of searching. She saved my life, raised you on her own, worked to make the community better, and still kept looking for her father. That's the kind of strength that lives on, you know. It becomes part of who we are. The boy looked at his mother's photo, now sitting next to the officer's computer. In the growing darkness of the office, with just the desk lamp glowing, he felt something he hadn't since she died. Hope. They weren't just following paper trails and old records. They were following his mother's footsteps, finishing her final journey. I think we're getting close, the officer said, his voice excited as new information appeared on his screen. Really close. Your mom left us more clues than we realized. She was always leaving light for others to follow. Now it's our turn to follow hers. The drive to Milwaukee felt like the longest 2 hours of the boy's life. He sat in the passenger seat of the officer's personal car, watching the landscape change from city to countryside and back to city again. His mother's photo rested safely in his lap, and every now and then, he glanced down at it for courage. Your grandfather owns a small bookstore, the officer explained, steering through the morning traffic. Been running it for 30 years. Your mom must have gotten her love of reading from him. He smiled softly, remembering the library where he'd found the boy just days ago. They'd discovered so much in their investigation. The old man had searched for his daughter too, but pride and misunderstandings had kept them apart. Letters sent to wrong addresses, phone numbers changed, and life's constant movement had turned a temporary separation into years of distance. Look, the officer pointed as they turned onto a quiet street lined with maple trees. There it is, the reading corner. A small bell chimed as they pushed open the shop's door, the smell of old books and coffee wrapping around them like a warm blanket. An elderly man stood behind the counter, his silver hair neatly combed, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He was helping a customer find a book, and his kind voice reminded the boy of story time at the library. When he looked up at the sound of the bell, his eyes crinkled with a welcoming smile. "Can I help you folks find something?" he asked, walking towards them. The boy's heart was pounding so hard, he thought everyone must be able to hear it. The officer gently placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Sir, we've come quite a way to meet you. I think we have something you've been looking for." He nodded encouragingly at the boy. With trembling fingers, the boy pulled out his mother's photo. The old man's reaction was immediate and powerful. His hands flew to his mouth, and he stumbled slightly, catching himself on a nearby bookshelf. "My little girl," he whispered, reaching for the photo with shaking hands. How did you?" His eyes moved from the photo to the boy's face, and suddenly he went very still. Recognition dawned in his eyes as he saw his daughter's features reflected in his grandson's face. "You're her son," he said softly, tears beginning to roll down his cheeks. "You're my grandson." He sank into a nearby reading chair, still staring at the photo. "I've been searching for her for so long. Every time the bell rings, I look up hoping." His voice broke. The officer stepped forward, explaining gently about the boy's mother, about her passing, about their discovery of the connection. The old man listened, his eyes never leaving his grandson's face, as if afraid he might disappear. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he took a worn photograph. A young girl with pigtails, sitting on these varied bookstore steps, surrounded by open books. "Your mother," he said, holding it out to the boy. "She used to spend hours here, reading everything she could get her hands on. Said she was going to write her own stories someday." The boy took the photo, seeing his mother as a child for the first time. "She did write stories," he said quietly. "She told me one every night before bed." The old man smiled through his tears. "She got that from me. I used to make up stories for her too." He looked around his bookstore, then back at his grandson. Would you like to hear some of them?" They spent the next few hours in the cozy corner of the bookstore, sharing stories and memories. The old man brought out albums filled with photos of his daughter growing up. Each picture, each story, helped the boy understand where he came from, who his mother had been before she was just Mom. "She was trying so hard to find you," the boy told his grandfather. "She never gave up." The old man wiped his eyes. "And now you found me instead," he said softly. "Sometimes love finds its way home, even if it takes a different path than we expected." The officer watched from a respectful distance as grandfather and grandson began to bridge the years of separation, their shared love for the remarkable woman who connected them, healing both their hearts. Outside, the afternoon sun painted the bookstore windows in warm gold, as if his mother was smiling down on this long-awaited reunion. The days that followed were filled with a gentle kind of magic. The boy sat in his grandfather's bookstore after school, doing his homework at the same corner table where his mother had once sat. Sometimes he'd catch his grandfather watching him with misty eyes, probably seeing shadows of his daughter in the way the boy bent over his books or chewed his pencil while thinking. "Your mother used to do that exact same thing," his grandfather said one afternoon, bringing over 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate. "She'd get so lost in her thoughts that her chocolate would get cold." He smiled, pulling up a chair. "I found something I think you should see." From behind the counter, he brought out a dusty box labeled School Days. Inside were notebooks filled with stories written in a child's careful handwriting. "These were your mother's," he explained, handling them like precious treasures. "She wrote a story every week for her English class. Always about heroes who helped others, just like she grew up to do." The boy ran his fingers over the faded ink, recognizing some of the bedtime stories she'd told him. All this time, she'd been sharing pieces of her childhood with him, keeping her father's memory alive in her own way. The officer visited often, checking on them and sharing meals. One evening, over pizza in the back room of the bookstore, he brought up something important. "We need to talk about making this official," he said gently. "Making sure you can stay with your grandfather legally." The boy looked up from his slice, anxiety creeping into his chest. But his grandfather reached over and squeezed his hand. "Nothing's going to separate us," the old man said firmly. "We've lost too much time already." They spent a weekend cleaning out the apartment above the bookstore. It had been used for storage, but with fresh paint and some furniture, it would make a perfect home for them both. The boy helped his grandfather move boxes, discovering old photos and memories in each one. "Look at this," his grandfather called out, holding up a small blue blanket. "Your mother's first blanket. She wouldn't sleep without it until she was 5. He pressed it to his cheek, then carefully folded it and handed it to the boy. "It's yours now." The officer brought over some of the boy's things from his old apartment, including his mother's favorite cooking pot and the height marks from the doorframe, carefully cut out and preserved. Each item found its new place in their home, bridging the past and present. One rainy afternoon, while arranging books on the shelves, the boy found an old diary. Inside, in his mother's teenage handwriting, was a letter she'd never sent. "Dear Dad, I'm sorry I ran away that day. We both said things we didn't mean. I've been trying to find the right words to say I'm sorry, but maybe sometimes sorry isn't enough. Maybe what we need is just to start again. I have a son now. He reminds me of you, always asking questions, always wanting to know the story behind everything. I hope someday he'll know you, even if I never find the courage to send this letter. Love always, your daughter." The boy showed the letter to his grandfather, who read it with trembling hands. They sat together on the old leather couch, sharing tears and memories, healing old wounds through understanding. "You know," his grandfather said, wiping his eyes, "your mother was right. Sometimes we need to just start again. And that's what we're doing now, isn't it? Starting our own story." The bookstore became more than just a shop. It became their sanctuary. Regular customers watched as the quiet boy, who sat in a corner, gradually began to smile more, to recommend books just like his grandfather did, to share stories about his mother with anyone who would listen. One day, a young girl came in looking for a book about heroes. The boy knew exactly where to find it. As he handed it to her, he caught sight of his mother's photo on the wall behind the counter, next to his grandfather's favorite reading chair. In that moment, he realized that sometimes the best stories are the ones that take unexpected turns, the ones that bring people together in ways they never imagined. His grandfather appeared beside him, resting a warm hand on his shoulder. "Your mother would be proud," he said softly. "So proud of how you're helping write our family's new chapter." The courthouse stood tall and imposing on a bright Tuesday morning. The boy adjusted his new tie, a gift from his grandfather, as they walked up the stone steps together. The officer was already waiting for them at the entrance, dressed in his formal uniform, polished badge gleaming in the sunlight. "Ready for the big day?" the officer asked, giving the boy an encouraging smile. His grandfather's hand was steady on his shoulder, a constant reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. Inside, the marble halls echoed with their footsteps. Other families waited on wooden benches, some looking nervous, others excited. A kind-faced woman approached them, their lawyer who had been helping make sure everything would go smoothly. "Remember what we practiced," she said warmly, leading them to their seats in the courtroom. "Just be honest when the judge asks you questions. This is about making official what's already in your hearts." The courtroom wasn't as scary as the boy had imagined. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, making patterns on the polished floor. His grandfather had explained that this was just a formality, making legal what they already knew was true in their hearts. Still, butterflies danced in his stomach as they waited. When the judge entered, everyone stood. She wasn't the stern figure the boy had expected. Instead, she had gentle eyes and a warm smile that reminded him of his third-grade teacher. "I've reviewed your case thoroughly," she began, looking through her papers. "And I have to say, it's one of the most touching I've seen in my years on the bench." The officer was called to testify first. He stood tall, his voice clear as he told their story. How he'd found the boy that night, the miraculous connection to his mother from years ago, the discovery of his grandfather. He spoke about watching their bond grow over the past weeks, about the healing he'd witnessed in both of them. "Your Honor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been on the force for 20 years. I've seen all kinds of families. What these two have, it's real. It's beautiful. They're helping each other heal." The social worker who'd been visiting them spoke next, describing how well the boy was settling into his new home above the bookstore. "He's thriving," she reported. "His grades are improving, he's making friends in the neighborhood, and most importantly, he's healing from his loss in a healthy way." Then it was the grandfather's turn. The old man stood, straightening his shoulders. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "I lost my daughter twice. Once when she left home as a teenager, and again when she passed away before we could reconcile. But through this boy, my grandson, I've found her again. He has her spirit, her kindness, her love of stories. I may have missed my chance to make things right with my daughter, but I can honor her memory by being the grandfather this boy deserves." The boy listened, holding his mother's photo in his pocket. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up slowly, his heart pounding. "I miss my mom every day," he said quietly. "But she always told me that family isn't just about blood. It's about love and choosing to be there for each other. My grandfather and I, we're choosing each other. We're making our own family story." The judge smiled, removing her glasses. "In my years on this bench, I've learned that the best families aren't always the ones we're born into. Sometimes they're the ones we find along the way. What I see here is nothing short of miraculous. A grandson and grandfather finding each other through loss, healing together, building something new." She picked up her gavel, her eyes kind. "It gives me great joy to make official what is already true in your hearts. I hereby grant full legal guardianship to the grandfather, with all the rights and responsibilities it entails." The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, but the boy barely heard it over the sound of his grandfather's happy sobs. They hugged tight, the officer joining them with tears in his own eyes. As they walked out into the bright sunlight, the boy felt different, lighter somehow. His grandfather squeezed his hand, and together they looked up at the clear blue sky. Somewhere up there, he was sure his mother was smiling down on her father and her son. Finally together, finally a family again. 5 years passed like pages turning in one of his grandfather's favorite books. The boy, now a teenager, stood behind the counter of the reading corner, helping a young girl find the perfect book. The store had changed over the years. New shelves, a cozy coffee corner, and a special section dedicated to local heroes, inspired by his mother's story. His mother's photo still held the place of honor on a wall, but now it was surrounded by new memories, pictures of him and his grandfather at baseball games, fishing trips, and countless birthday celebrations. The officer, who had become like a second father, featured in many of them too. "What about this one?" the teenager suggested, pulling out a book about everyday heroes. "It's got real stories about regular people who did amazing things." The young girl's eyes lit up as she took the book, reminding him of how he used to get excited about his mother's bedtime stories. After the customer left, he walked over to the newly installed community board near the entrance. It was covered with flyers for the youth mentoring program he'd started at the local police station. The program paired kids who had lost parents with police officers who could be their mentors and friends. "Just like your mother," his grandfather said proudly, appearing beside him with 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate, their daily tradition. Always finding ways to help others. The old man's hair was a little whiter now, his steps a bit slower, but his eyes still sparkled with the same warmth. The bell of the door chimed, and the officer walked in, still in his uniform after his shift. He did this often. stopping by to share stories about the kids in the mentoring program or just to check in on his favorite bookstore family. "You won't believe what happened today," the officer said, settling into his usual armchair. "Remember that story about your mom saving my life? I told it to a group of new recruits during training. One of them started crying. Turns out his aunt used to work at that same diner. She always told him about the waitress who saved a police officer's life. Your mom's story is still inspiring people even now." The teenager smiled, touching the small silver badge pinned to his shirt. A junior police volunteer badge he'd earned through his work with a mentoring program. Next fall, he would start college, majoring in social work, the same dream his mother had once pursued. "I found something interesting this morning," his grandfather said, pulling out an old, dusty notebook from under the counter. "It's your mom's old diary from when she was your age." He opened it carefully to a marked page. "Listen to this. Sometimes I think about the kind of person I want to be. I want to be someone who makes a difference, even in small ways. Maybe I can't change the whole world, but I can change somebody's world. That's enough for me." The teenager felt tears warming his eyes. That's exactly what she had done, changed people's worlds, one kind act at a time. And now, through him, through the mentoring program, through every child who walked into this bookstore looking for stories about heroes, her legacy lived on. The door chimed again as Mrs. Chen walked in. Yes, the same neighbor who had helped him that terrible morning 5 years ago. She now came to the store every week, helping run their Saturday morning reading circle for local kids. The new children's books arrived, she called out cheerfully, carrying a box. "And I brought those cookies the kids love." The teenager moved to help her with the box, catching his reflection in the store window. He saw himself, but he also saw traces of his mother, in his smile, in his way with people, in his desire to help others. His grandfather always said he had her heart, and now he understood what that truly meant. Later that evening, as the sun set and cast long shadows through the bookstore windows, he stood with his grandfather and the officer, looking at his mother's photo. "You know," he said softly, "she never really left us. She just gave us a different kind of story to tell." His grandfather wrapped an arm around him, and the officer placed a hand on his shoulder. Together, they stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by books filled with countless stories, but none quite as precious as their own. A tale of loss and love, of finding family in unexpected places, and of how one person's kindness could echo through generations, touching lives in ways they never imagined. Above the bookstore, in their cozy apartment, his mother's old blanket still lay folded on his bed, and her stories still lived in his heart. But now he had his own stories to tell, his own way of making the world a little better, one small act of kindness at a time.